Tonight we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenét Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 32 in the ongoing series. In this episode, we deal with Burke Ramsey's interview in 1998. It went on for 6 hours, 2 hours a day over 3 days, and it has never been published in full. You can find snippets of it on Radar Online, in parts of the CBS documentary, in this or that A&E documentary, to some extent on the Dr. Phil show, and printed excerpts in the National Enquirer. That's the October 3rd, 2016 issue. Before we get to that police interview on June the 10th, the 11th and the 12th, 1998, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. Thank you to the 200 or 300 who have subscribed since the last video. And let's get started. So I've got to tell you, I've spent about 3 hours trying to collate the information that I've been looking for in preparation for this video. I've got all the information in front of me. I've got a pile of books. I've got multiple browser windows open. And I can tell you, even as someone who's written multiple books about the case, who's researched all of this backwards and forwards, inside and out, in every possible way, this particular part of the Ramsey case is definitely very tricky, just in terms of trying to find it. So let me give an example. The Burke Ramsey interview from June 1998, although it was published in the National Enquirer, it doesn't appear in the National Enquirer book, JonBenét, The Police Files, right? Both her parents' interviews in full appear there, but not this particular interview. Another thing that I think is worth highlighting is that in the Ramsey's book, Death of Innocence, unless I missed something, I can't find a reference to that police interview. One thing I do want to highlight from Death of Innocence is from page 350, and this is referring to the grand jury testimony that Burke gave. Now, bear in mind, the Ramseys themselves weren't called to testify, but their son was. Now, just think about this in a very basic way. The Ramseys have got 2 children. The one child has died, has been murdered. The surviving child you never sort of hear from. You never really see Burke Ramsey. You don't sort of have the kind of access to him or coverage of him that you have of kind of everybody else. And what is interesting, on page 350 of Death of Innocence, they talk about, there's a quote, "The issue of Burke's testimony became our next concern. We didn't object to his testifying before the grand jury, but we worried about subjecting our son to a process that might prove emotionally damaging," end quote. Now, they're talking about, I think, something that was going on in 1988, so 2 years later. So they worried that Burke might be emotionally damaged by being asked questions. Now, we've already looked at the first interview, which occurred, I think, just less than 2 weeks after the incident, right? And that was mandatory. It's mandatory from the Department of, is it Social Services or Child Protective Services, that it's mandatory that you've got to talk to a child, interview a child in a situation like happened in the Ramsey home, right? The second interview was sort of done in an effort to almost excuse Burke from testifying before the grand jury. So the impression I get, and I could be wrong, the impression I get is that the Ramseys sort of consented to Burke being interviewed by a detective. So this is different to the first interview, which is sort of by a child psychologist. This one was by a police detective. Obviously, the questions are going to be different. They're going to be more targeted. They're going to be more related to the evidence and the incident itself, and less sort of loosey-goosey, just about are you happy, how are you doing kind of thing. And the detective, Dan Schuler, was represented by the Boulder District Attorney's Office. So he was actually, I guess, handpicked by the District Attorney's Office. I don't think he was selected by Boulder PD. And at the time when this happened, the media reported it that Burke Ramsey is not a suspect, but is a potential witness. And it's a little bit late in the day, if you think about it, for that to sort of come to light. Well, it's 1998. Burke might be a potential witness. Oh, okay, well, maybe we should speak to him, don't you think? And so the hope from the Ramseys was that Burke, speaking to this detective at length, as I say, it was 2 hours over, I think it was 3 days. In other words, a total of 6 hours. It's a lot of. That's a huge transcript, right? That is about as much as Patsy Ramsey spoke during her first interview, and a lot less than, or a lot more than what John said during his first interview. So just to put that in perspective, and so ultimately, when Burke, he was speaking to the detective with the idea that that would excuse him from appearing before the grand jury. Well, that didn't happen. He was called in front of the grand jury regardless. And if I'm not mistaken, Burke testified for basically the entire day on that day that he was called. If we go back to Death of Innocence, they talk about, so they worried that, if Burke says something about what he saw, it could be emotionally damaging for him. Then halfway through page 350, and this is quoting from Death of Innocence, they write, quote, "We discovered that the police had interrogated Burke on the morning of December 26, 1996. We didn't know about that until the subpoena came from the grand jury with a record of when the police had talked to Burke." And then they go on to talk about reviewing documents and wondering what interview occurred on the 26th, right? And then they put two and two together and realized they meaning the police, specifically Fred Patterson, had interrogated Burke at the White's house while, and this is a quote, "we were desperately waiting to get JonBenét back," end quote. Then there's an interesting fact here. And this is midway through page 350. They talk about Burke was questioned for 41 minutes. It's pretty specific. It's quite a long time as well. And that the interrogation had been without our permission or awareness, and that is illegal under Colorado law. So this is quite an interesting and quite a strident point made in Death of Innocence, that while the police broke protocol, the police violated the Ramsey's rights, possibly violated Burke's rights. And I'm not quite sure what the exact details are of the law, but there was an adult present, and the adult was identified as Burke's grandmother, but it actually turned out to be, I think, Fleet Jr.'s grandmother. So there was an adult present. The other thing is, I don't think it was an interrogation, and, to the Ramseys, I think, relief, Fred Patterson kind of came out of that questioning session like, well, I'm pretty sure Burke's innocent. He didn't behave oddly, and he seemed completely normal. So there was nothing really that came out of that damaged the Ramseys. But nevertheless, they felt that what had happened was illegal. Now, what's kind of interesting with that is, you could argue that there was some kind of I don't want to say witness tampering, but you could argue that police protocol had overstepped its mark, and that so you could sort of have some sort of legal counter argument to talking to Burke, right? Then the other thing that's really interesting is on the same page 350, they talk about wanting to secretly get Burke into town and then into the Justice Center. They said it just wasn't right to subject a 12-year-old to such a barrage. I think they're talking about the media. So they wanted to sort of smuggle Burke into the courtroom and then smuggle him out again. And this wasn't just a little operation in Boulder. It was really getting him from their house in Atlanta and kind of out of school. And then Susan Stein would be part of this operation. We're still going to talk about the Steins. And then exchanging cars and going to the one airport, and Susan Stein wearing one of Patsy's wigs. And then I think all of this played out on May the 19th, 1999. And according to this story, the Ramseys didn't seem to know or were under the impression that the media didn't know that Burke actually testified. So they go into kind of a lot more detail about how they sort of schemed, that's a word that is used here on page 351, to get Burke to the district attorney's office and to get Burke to the Justice Center, and in the end he testified for a full day. So I could go into a bit more detail about that, but that's not really what we want to talk about. And as I say, I could be mistaken, but I don't see anywhere in The Death of Innocence a reference to the second interview. There is the reference to the first interview where Patsy was present, but I don't see any reference to Dan Schuller in this 3-day interview. If I'm mistaken, please leave a comment showing me the source of that. I mean, I'm not going to read the whole book just to make absolutely sure, but I did go through it chronologically and systematically, and I just didn't come across anything in June 1998. So I could have missed it, but it doesn't appear to be in this book. Now, what is quite frustrating and quite weird is that when you go through all the other narratives, this particular aspect is dealt with in a very loosey-goosey way. I think it is very underestimated and it's very under-analyzed, right? I don't know if that's really a word, but it's just not treated with the kind of urgency and seriousness that I think it deserves. And so the next narrative I'm just going to refer to in this regard is Steve Thomas's book, JonBenét, Inside the Ramsey Investigation. And I want to sort of be honest and fair about, it's not as though it's not as though this information is sort of lying around, and so you've got a lot of material to work with to talk about and discuss and integrate into the narrative. So you've got to acknowledge that there's an incredible amount of difficulty getting this information. Now, it may not seem that way in 2021, especially because quite a lot of this material came out in 2016. But if you think about it, 2016 is 18 years after 1998. So for 18 years, where was this information? And a lot of people didn't even know it existed. And even those who did know that it existed weren't really able to necessarily either get access to it or to get access to all of it. It sort of feels like selected pieces of that 6-hour interview were given to people. So small little segments of it were made available, but certainly not the whole thing. And that is potentially the holy grail of the Ramsey case, that 6-hour interview and transcript. Now, I've spoken about Detective Harmer before as someone who is also not really acknowledged as much as I think she ought to be. She's referenced on page 342 of Steve Thomas's book. And he's talking about the pineapple, knowing that it wasn't served at the White's party. That is something that comes up in the Schuler interview. Bear in mind, Schuler is now armed with more than 2 years worth of discovery. He knows exactly what are the crucial things to ask about. And of course, pineapple was found in JonBenét's stomach contents, indicating that she didn't go to sleep at night. She didn't go straight to bed. It indicated that she must have gotten up or she was awake all along and she ate something. In other words, the fact that she ate after being at the Whites indicates that she wasn't sleeping. And that starts to call into question a lot. It starts to call into question the version of events of Patsy and John, and to some extent Burke, that everybody was sleeping. Well, it looks like JonBenét wasn't sleeping. If JonBenét wasn't sleeping, was there anyone else that wasn't sleeping? And so one of those people turned out to be Burke. Burke wasn't sleeping either, and that is acknowledged in this interview with Dan Schuler. Now, bear in mind, if Burke wasn't sleeping, he could have literally bumped into the intruder, or he could have bumped into the murderer, or he could have bumped into somebody who was running around the house that shouldn't have been at that time of the night, right? And I think in the interview with Dr. Phil, he talks about going downstairs and working on a machine or something. And so you can kind of almost imagine if the intruder's in the house, and he wanted to do whatever he wanted to do, maybe he was writing the ransom note, he or she was sort of, oh wow, Burke's here, I better hold on, I better wait till he goes to bed, or I better whatever it is. So what I want to emphasize here is it's a little bit further in Steve Thomas's narrative. It's page 354, where he refers to Burke Ramsey interviewed in Atlanta for 2 hours a day on consecutive days in early June. I don't think he refers to it being 3 consecutive days, so I don't know if he really specifically acknowledges that it was 6 hours in total. But I mean, when you read it here, you sort of get the feeling it might be for 4 hours. So 2 hours a day on consecutive days. Consecutive days kind of implies perhaps 2 days. The other thing is he spells Schuller's name with one L. I think it's with 2 L's. He spells it with 2 L's. As far as I know, it is spelled with one L. So that can also cause confusion when you searching for information, right? The thing that's kind of interesting is he talks about, so Burke at this stage is 11 years old, and this is something that I really want to emphasize is, if you really want to be a master of the Ramsey case, someone who has knowledge beyond everybody else, besides the smorgasbord of evidence and all that kind of thing, besides having this intimate knowledge of the layout of the house, of the crime scene, besides that stuff, you kind of need to know the sort of backstory and background and the character arc of the individuals in this case, meaning you need to know what the full story was of little JonBenét's life from a baby until she was 6 years old. So you need to know her full backstory. I don't just mean the pageants, I mean everything that happened in her life, and that takes a lot of time. You need to get to know the person that was JonBenét Ramsey. You need to get to know the person that was Patsy Ramsey. So you need to go into her background. Where did she grow up? She grew up in a small town. What then? What did she study? Right? Same with John Ramsey. Going through his childhood, his military history, his business history as well. And it's a painful, tedious, time-consuming process, but you need to do it. And it's difficult to say, who do you stop with? Do you also go through other individuals? But an individual that I think many people have not done that with is Burke Ramsey. What about Burke Ramsey as a little boy? What was his journey? What was it like being the sibling of JonBenét? What was his story? What was his experience? And so if you take it a sort of a shortcut to that, and it's never good to take shortcuts in true crime, but a shortcut to that process is basically you can look at the first, the footage of the first interview of Burke Ramsey, in January 1997, and then just you don't have to pay too much attention to what he's saying, but you want to get a sense of, just a basic sense of the spirit of this little boy. How does he talk? How does he move? What is the basic feeling that he's feeling? What kind of person is this? Right? Then you look at the next interview, which is in 1998, a year and a half later. So you're dealing now with, you first dealt with almost 10-year-old Burke. Now you're dealing with 11-and-a-half-year-old Burke, right? And what has changed in that time? Well, obviously he's taller, but what you also want to know is, so how confident is he? Also, how has his body language changed? What about the intonation? How is he maturing? What is going on? How does he respond to questions? Does he respond to questions differently than he did in the first interview? And then you have the third one where you jump forward 20 years from the very first interview, I guess 18 and a half, 19 years from the second, and there is Burke opposite Dr. Phil, a grown man, and then you take that Burke, the adult Burke, and you see how has the adult changed from the child on the one hand, and how has the adult stayed the same. And overall, you want to look at all three videos, all three sets of footage, and kind of get a sense of, okay, so this is Burke. This is who this kid is. So although the Ramseys weren't present at this interview with Detective Schuler, and I think this interview actually happened in Georgia. It actually happened in Atlanta, not at Boulder PD. You had two lawyers present. So the Ramseys weren't present, but guess who was present? Pete Hofstrom, I think the assistant district attorney or something, and the Ramsey lawyer Jim Jenkins. Right, he was also present, and then Steve Thomas provides a very interesting kind of backstory. So again, it's not really shedding light on the interview itself. It's just sort of giving you some context. He talks about an idiotic order that the cops were told to stay out of Georgia. Bear in mind, this is now in 1998. Okay, and then apparently they changed their minds on that, and then Detective Jane Harmer was allowed to fly to Atlanta to represent the Boulder cops. So the Boulder cops were sort of represented there as an interested party to find out what is going on, right? So you've got the lawyers there. Well, let's also have a cop there to kind of get a sense of what happened there. Then, according to Thomas, quote, she was kept waiting in a hotel room for hours before being contacted by Pete Hofstrom, who then refused to tell her where the meeting with Burke would take place. Harmer changed her ticket and returned to Boulder early. Videotapes of Burke's interviews were sent back to us for review, end quote. So it's not completely clear here, but from that, I understand that to mean Jane Harmer went to Atlanta to attend this interview, wasn't told where it was, and then just kind of came back. So in other words, she didn't attend it, right? Boulder police were sort of frustrated from actually watching this thing. And it does make you wonder, if she did attend it, what would have happened? What would she have asked? On the other hand, it's possible that because she didn't attend, the lawyers present actually wanted to find out what was going on. Perhaps they were curious. And so it led to a longer, bear in mind, it wasn't as though Jane Harmer being there caused the interview to be shorter. It was quite a long, extensive, in-depth interview. It does feel like it's a pity that Jane Harmer returned, but it seems like videotapes were sent back to them anyway for review, so they did get to see it. But doesn't it seem like a bit of a fishy situation, locking the Boulder cops out of the thing? And bear in mind, I've already mentioned it, that John Ramsey and his son have said that, the reason that this case has not gone anywhere for so many years is because the Boulder cops botched it, because they lacked enthusiasm, because their hearts weren't in it. Do you remember that? Steve Thomas actually talks about hoping to be included in the trip to Atlanta. He also wanted to be present, and you really needed someone there who knew the Ramsey story and knew the sort of permutations to know what to think and what to ask and so on. And so he wasn't there either. He talks about Harmer and I could still have covered a lot of ground. And then he quotes Beckner, I think, who was the chief of police at the time, I could be wrong, saying that there is resistance to Thomas in Atlanta, meaning the cop, there's not a friendly. Detective Steve Thomas couldn't really expect a friendly reception if he was in Atlanta from the Ramseys and their supporters. On page 355, this is quoting from Steve Thomas. In my opinion, Team Ramsey apparently had such a firm hold on the current negotiations that we could no longer even do routine police work without their say-so, end quote. Further down through page 355, Detective Thomas goes into the interview in some detail. Now, in the Patreon section, we're going to actually drill into some of the transcript fragments that we've got. And, when you go through enough of them, it does actually add up to a fair amount. Certainly, I don't think it adds up to more than 5 or 10 minutes worth, but it's not nothing. It's certainly quite a bit. We also go into some of the video footage and some of the audio. But what is highlighted by Steve Thomas is he talks about Burke seems to have recovered his memory. So compared to some of the questions he was asked in January 1997. And then he says, quote, but to me his answers seemed awkward and he was clearly uncomfortable, end quote. I've got to say I agree with that. When you see Burke on the couch, he is not sitting comfortably. He's certainly not nearly as comfortable as the detective questioning him. And he kind of squirms in many different positions. He sort of sometimes has his knees up to his chin. Sometimes he's sitting on his sort of ankles or whatever. Other times he has his feet kind of very close to the interviewer, Dan Schuller, and his head as far as possible in the other direction, almost like he's lounging on the couch. But you kind of get the sense that I'm not sure if you could say that if he's struggling with his concentration or he just really doesn't want to be in the room kind of thing. He's struggling to sort of just settle down. He can't sit still, put it that way. What Steve Thomas highlights in his book about this interview is that when Burke was asked how he thought JonBenét had been killed, this time he replied, I have no idea. Now, remember in his first interview, he was quite explicit. Steve Thomas describes Burke being explicit in describing what happened to her. Remember he said, I know what happened to her. And then he kind of role-played it. Now he has no idea. And apparently he confirmed that her bedwetting had been a big problem. Now I'm not quite sure whether that is the first interview or the second. I've got an idea it's the second, but I could be wrong. Now he refers to Burke pulling his legs up and his chin, having his chin on his knees. and talking about playing Nintendo on the afternoon of December 25th. What were you doing, Burke, on Christmas Day? Well, I was playing with my Nintendo. Steve Thomas specifically highlights the photograph of a pineapple and bowl that Burke is shown by the detective. And Burke says he recognized the bowl. Detective Steve Thomas, now bear in mind, he's in a frustrating position where he's got to review the video and he can't knock on the window and say, ask him this or what about that. Steve Thomas makes the point that this pineapple wasn't carried into the house. It was there all along. It was something that was retrieved, like so many other things, from inside the house. Then what I find really interesting, and I've highlighted this in the book in yellow magic marker, this part, quote, he recalled nothing unusual at the Whites' party other than getting a mild shock from the electric deer fence outside. So Burke has kind of an unpleasant experience at the Whites where he maybe feels a little bit humiliated by it, but he touches an electric fence and gets a shock. Does he cry? Is there a sort of kind of an issue around that? That can be quite distressing for a child, being not electrocuted, but certainly, shocked by something that you don't expect. He talks about his sister falling asleep in the car on the way home, but that she awakened to help carry presents into the house of a friend. That's a part that we don't really know about, really, which friend. And then it goes on to say, when they got home, JonBenét walked in slowly and went up the spiral stairs to bed just ahead of Patsy. And Steve Thomas emphasizes this quite correctly. Quote, that was quite a difference from the initial and frequently repeated story that she was carried to bed. I felt that this poor kid was confused and that he really had no idea what had happened that night. End quote. Then there's a reference to the house creaking and sort of other things. He does, I think the final thing I'm just going to refer to here, although there's just so much you want to refer to, on page 356, Burke said to, and I think this is to Detective Patterson, that he didn't get out of bed that morning, but he remembered thinking that when the cops arrived, they would be tied up all day. Those are the words he used. And, he was disappointed that they wouldn't be going to Charlevoix. Now, just think about those words, to say, wow, we're going to be tied up all day, and look at what the situation was with JonBenét, in terms of how she was found. You could even take it further than that and say that JonBenét was tied up all day, meaning, she was lying on the floor in the wine cellar, tied up all day until she was discovered. Now, there are two additional references I want to go through, one in Kolar's book and the other in Woodward's book, but I'm going to do that in the Patreon section, along with playing some of the audio and actually going through some sections of the transcript. So for those on YouTube, thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.